Ready?
Stone Super Cruise. Stone Super Super. I think I remember the one. There's like a speed running panel. I think I remember the one. There's like a speed running panel. It's a special.
A hero properly is someone who has given his life to something bigger than himself or other than himself. That's the message of the myth. You, as you know yourself, are not the final term of your being. And you must die to that one way or another, in giving of yourself to something or in being annihilated, actually, physically, to return, you might say, or to recognize. Life is always on the edge of death, always. And one should lack fear and have the courage of life. That's the principal initiation of all of the heroic stories.
Hello, everybody. Whoa, that's loud. PAX 2020, howdy. Welcome to our chat tonight, Holy Ocarina, exploring religion in the Legend of Zelda. First off, I want to thank y'all for being here, because you guys braved a pandemic to come out here. I mean, this is a place, if the CDC is going to quarantine us, why not in a place with a bunch of video games? So, but I wanted to thank you, and you guys should all give yourself a round of applause for making it out. We do have a great panel for you tonight. We are interested, we love the topic, we love Zelda, we're glad you all do too, but we have a lot to talk about, so we're going to move pretty quickly. So let's do some quick introductions. We got our panelists here. I'd like to introduce Bo Everly from UNC Chapel Hill, a scholar of religion and politics. Then we have John Sanders, who is a representative from an instructor and curriculum designer for International Ivy. And then last but not least, we got John Borchert, who is an editor for Game Environments. And then we had two of our folks who could not be here tonight, unfortunately, but they have been helping out in the back. We have Andrew Henry, who is the creative content designer for Religion for Breakfast, and Javed Starrett, who made that amazing hype video and who is hopefully watching on the Twitch live stream right now. So if you guys could give him a round of applause. And follow his work at the Hyrule Journals. And then last but not least, I'm your host and moderator for this evening. My name is Jordan Lowen. I'm producer and content creator for the Coin-Operated Collective. And if you all, as we talk and as we chat, as we're going through tonight, if you have questions and things that come up to your mind, feel free to tweet at coinop_collect, and we'll try to bring those kind of conversations live into our discussion. So, with that being said, religion and the Legend of Zelda. Religion is one of those iffy topics that people are kind of uncomfortable chatting about, and we're here to try to help us process through different ways of doing that. All four of us are in some ways religion scholars or interested in the study of religion, and as scholars we approach the conversation, we approach the topic of religion differently than what most people might think about. We don't necessarily talk about belief, we don't necessarily talk about faith, we don't necessarily do theology. We're interested in religion as a cultural phenomenon, this thing that all humans across all times seem to be involved in or touched by in some way or another. With that being said, the definition we use or how we approach the study is with this. So we look at religion as value systems that shape and orient thoughts, actions, and feelings of individuals and communities as they relate to the world and otherworldly forces, places, and beings. And that last bit is the key aspect to why we can talk about religion in the Legend of Zelda. When we think about digital worlds and virtual worlds, those are otherworldly spaces in which we humans are encountering other beings and being changed and changing the world. To help kind of process this and to kind of keep us in bounds for this really kind of broad conversation, we kind of broke things down into three ways. We're going to be looking at the religion of the Legend of Zelda, religion in the Legend of Zelda, and Legend of Zelda as religion. So these are our three major kind of topics for the evening, but we want you all to be involved as much in what we're going on here. So with each of these major themes, we're actually going to have you vote on kind of subtopics to how this conversation is going to flow. So in some sense, we want you to partake in this adventure and in this conversation. So in doing that, if you guys have your smartphone devices, you can text at the number 22333 and text that really long word right there. It's Full Temple 033. So there'll be 3 opportunities for you to vote on the topic that you'd like to explore, and when it comes up, you should be able to text A, B, or C, and then that'll pop up and we'll kind of move on. So we'll give you all a few seconds to do that, and then we're going to jump right in. Okay, I see phones going. And we'll go. Okay, so the first topic we're going to hit is religion of the Legend of Zelda. So here, this topic is exploring the in-world religion of Zelda. What are the ways religion functions in the game world, in its story, in its myth? And we've broken this down into 3 kind of key core categories. So we're looking at the Triforce, We're looking at the legend of The Legend of Zelda. What does that mean? What does that look like? And then we're looking at Hylianism, the idea that the in-game world of Zelda has this particular kind of well-defined religious tradition. So those are your three options. The next page, the vote should go live if the technology gods love us, and you will be able to vote. And it's going to go very quickly because we only have like 25 seconds. So people should be able to follow the instructions up top. Text, okay, we got one person going, and now it's a race. What are we going to talk about? What are we going to talk about? Actually, I think with that filled up, we're probably going to talk about Hylianism, because we had a limited number of people we could do votes with. So, Hylianism is our first topic. Great. So, let's jump in to make sure we move along. So, is Hylianism a religion? It might actually, even before we talk about is Hylianism a religion, look at maybe kind of what it is or examples of it. So I'm actually going to ask John Sanders, can you kind of label some examples of what you might think of when we talk about Hylianism?
Sure. So when we're talking about Hylianism, we're kind of talking about across the Legend of Zelda canon, the ways that the Hylian people specifically, so most of the people that we see as humans in the works, as what their belief systems are, who they pray to, what their gods are, their myths, and their beliefs. So reason we're saying Hylianism rather than Hyruleanism or whatever you'd like to call it is because we have in Skyward Sword Hylia as this goddess on top of the three other goddesses that you see over there. So we're trying to figure out like what are some of the tenets of this religion, how are some ways that this is shown, and there's basically a lot of different ways across the ways that religions are shown. One of the strange things that people have pointed out, especially in the later games, we have all these temples, the water temple, temple of time, these things, but they don't really look like a regular space. Like, if you look at the temple of time right there, there's no pews. So clearly it's not for people sitting around and seeing this. It's not a temple in the same way that a church or a synagogue or a temple is. But what sort of purpose it has might be explained by some other temples. Temples that are more about labyrinths and about finding your way through things. And depending on what we consider like the major tenet of Hylianism and how the Triforce works, we might consider the act of going through a labyrinth as a ritual to achieve this sort of balance between wisdom, power, and courage.
Great, and on the next question, I'll kind of open it up to all three of you, so feel free to jump in and jump out. What's the point of having kind of a fictional religious language? What is it doing in the game for the player? Like, what's the point? Why have a religion at all?
Right. As Jordan mentioned, I work with a journal called Game Environments. It's the only journal that looks at religion in video games specifically. And what I like to focus on when I think about religion in video games is religion as a system and games as a system, right? And how these two things, at what point do these two things interact as systems for meaning making or subjectivity formation, forming opinions, forming value systems. So what does an in-game religion or a religion of a game do? It orients you, I think, primarily, right? It orients certain value systems. But what it's able to do, because it's in a game specifically, is orient through practice, through actual interaction, right? So it's the game, you're not only acting and playing in the game is also acting and performing back on you all the time, right? We know this when we're running into invisible walls and falling into invisible floors. It's all becoming really, really visible, right? How the game as a system is interacting with you. Now, if you lay in an in-game kind of religion or an in-game belief system, an in-game value system that operates on top of and through a game already as a system, you're laying in the values of that religious system or that belief system or that value system on top of or through the game mechanics. So religion in games and a specific religion in a game can function on you through this kind of performative way, in a way that something that's purely narrative, right, couldn't do. So when we're looking at The Legend of Zelda and the religions that are taking place in the game, I always like to think about how is it acting on you, like John says, through a temple, through a religious object, through a particular quest, right? you're made to orient towards these things, and then the question becomes, well, what is the game trying to tell me by making me do this, right? Or what kind of option do I have to escape from participating in this battle?
I guess, yeah, I'll push a little bit back or kind of want to expand it out. So in this fictional world where Hylianism might be a religion, like, well, one, who is this religion for? And who has designed it? Who has created it? Because I think those are important questions, whether you're exploring any type of religion. Who has the power and where does it lie? Can the three of you maybe kind of chat on that, speak on that?
Yeah, I'll chime in quickly and build on what John was saying. In the field of religious studies, there's a lot of discourse on religious objects and kind of the way in which objects have a kind of agency to inform our subjectivity, inform how we think about ourselves, when there's kind of a long tradition of just thinking that humans and maybe animals and kind of conscious creatures have that kind of agency. And to your question, Jordan, I think what's exciting about exploring a world of digital objects that are imbued with meaning, but we maybe are not sure what it is just seeing how it's going to affect us, even if we're not on solid ground about what they're supposed to be.
So in some sense, you're talking about, let's have a specific example here. So the Triforce, how is the Triforce functioning religiously? In some sense, you're talking about on us as player, the Triforce is doing something maybe through the narrative, but for the people of the Legend of Zelda world, how do we see those in-game objects, those in-game ideas and stories shaping and changing them?
Well, one of the fun things about being in a fantasy setting is that you also get actual power from the Triforce as well that you see. So besides just being kind of an object like a symbol for religion, from the cross to the Torah or ideas like this, of maybe being a symbol of a balance between power, wisdom, and courage. You actually have it acting in some ways too. In the Oracle of Seasons games, which might be a different sort of canon because they're made by Capcom, there was actually talk of the Triforce sending Link to these places, like having a will of its own. And yet, in other places, it's described as something that gives wishes. That's all it does. So no matter whether it is a good person or a bad person, as long as they have the strength of will, it will fulfill that wish. So there's typically, of a lot of religious objects, a lot of strange mysteries around the Triforce, and we also have a cult or a group of people, the Sheikah, who control the royal family and have a lot of secrets towards the Triforce as well. So there are a lot of standings of religion within the narrative itself, looking at the Triforce as a godhead / symbol.
And in some sense, I think you spoke on that a little bit. It seems like the Triforce might be most controlled by the religious family of Hyrule, which is interesting because, in two functions. In the one sense, as a Triforce, it was initially of the three goddesses. So you had these three goddesses of this world, these religious deities who formed this material object, yet people don't worship the goddesses necessarily in Hyrule, other than maybe Hylia in that first round. So this power object, this thing that becomes a religious symbol, this religious identity, seems to be tied to maybe a royal family, or kind of a royal lineage, as opposed to maybe a priestly class like we might think of in everyday religion.
Yeah, and just to jump onto the tail end of that, when we're thinking about religion in general, and in this specific example, when does religion start looking like nationalism, right? In the Legend of Zelda, right, or something like this? When does kind of is this kind of a class of people that's being ruled by a national identity or by a religious identity? And so thinking about religion in gaming and religion of gaming, that's when those lines and the idea of religion becomes a lot less clear. Right? And I think we can take that, and that can bleed outside of these games, and games can teach us about, what's the difference between nationalism and religion, or something like that, or how do they function differently? Yeah, through symbols and objects and royal families and things like that.
And we have all these characters in the Zelda games that are outside of that religion, seemingly.
Yeah.
Right? Like the Gorons and the Zoras aren't necessarily defenders of the Triforce in the same way that the Hylians seem to be. And we have these great fairy figures across the whole thing, which seem to be kind of these similar to like Jinn in Islamic faiths or things, which are these powerful beings that are somewhat associated with gods, but not quite associated with devils in the same way. So there's kind of these liminal spaces in these worlds as well. And of course, in looking at the Ocarina of Time, the Deku Tree, the natural world itself, tells the story what happens as well. So there's a lot of different sources that you get that are kind of mixed from that.
Also, I think it says something that the majority of temples and religious buildings we see in Hyrule are empty.
Yeah.
You know, what does that say?
Empty, flooded, filled with traps.
About a particular
Arbitrarily.
Not sure if that's a faith I want to practice.
I don't know what being a Hylianism priest looks like in this world, but probably means a lot more spikes and more exercise than I'm used to.
And I'll just chime in quickly and say, yeah, just because less people are going to church doesn't mean a religion is more or less powerful.
Yeah, of course.
So that's about all the time we have for this section, because again, we want to keep moving. There's a whole bunch we won't get to talk about. We want to make sure we talk about the stuff that you guys want to talk about. So let's move on to our next section here, looking at religions in The Legend of Zelda. So here what we're exploring are, how do we see the religions of our supposed real world, or the world that we all live in here, kind of finding their ways into the game system, whether it's through images, whether it's through myths, whether it's through rituals. This game was created by fellow humans, and as humans we're informed by our culture, our practice, our places of context, and those things find their ways to trickle into the art that we create. So this question, or this kind of topic is looking at that. How do we see the religions of our world today functioning in this game in different ways? So again, we're going to go to the next voting screen, and you all participated so hard last time, it's probably not going to take long again. So it should be live now. Oh, that was quick. Again, man, that was way too fast. Okay, so it looks like cultural myths wins. So we're exploring cultural myths in the Legend of Zelda series. Let's open this up again. John, I want to have you kind of open this one. Do you want to talk a bit about some of the particular cultural kind of traditions or ideas that you saw kind of popping up and informing the gameplay, or even just the game world?
Sure. And as you can see from the slide, we might not get to all of the things, but there's a wide range of influences across cultures that a lot of these are pulled from. One of the things I wanted to point out here are two general bodies of myths and stories. Some things that are pulled directly from the myths and stories that you actually reenact them in the game, and some that are pulled kind of more from the ether, or like the aura of these stories. One of them is the one on the far right there, or left, your left, was the myth of the Enoshima Shrine in Enoshima, Japan, and the story of the goddess Binzaiten. And she is a beautiful goddess that descends from the sky into this really chaotic world run by this dragon. And as she touches the earth or the water, she creates an island, and that's the island of Enoshima. She, in her wisdom and beauty, comes to this dragon who falls in love with her instantly and says, yes, I will let you marry me, but only if you protect the people of this land. So we have this power and this wisdom of this beautiful figure together in this single character. And this image I like because we have similar to Robes of Zelda in Ocarina of Time, but just a little thing there. There's also, if you look down there, you might see the Triforce symbol, which is, for some of you might know if you've been to Japan, is an actual symbol that's around Japan. It's described as the Mitsu Uroko, or the three scales, and it comes from another myth that comes from this same Binzaiten myth. Apparently the Hojo Tokimasa in 552 CE came forth to this shrine in Enoshima and asked for prophecy, asked for wisdom and guidance. And a woman who is described as Binzaiten later comes forth and gives him a prophecy of how his clan will prosper, the Hojo clan. And when she leaves, she turns either into a fish or a lizard or a dragon of some sort and leaves behind three scales, which he uses as his crest. So that's an actual crest that you find along a lot of different places, but also on like everything from skis to other commercial sites. So those are like ideas that are similar to this, the ideas of people going and receiving things from goddesses and beautiful and wise versus powerful things. But then there are also more specific myths and cultural ideas. So the one over there says The Spider's Thread was a 1918 short story by Ryosake Katagawa, who was talking about a story where the Buddha sees a man trying to climb up from hell, who was an evil man and like a thief. His name was Kandana. But he says, I remember that you once saved a spider because you took pity on him, so I'll leave down a spider's thread so you can climb up. Of course, as Kandana's climbing up, he gets furious at the others trying to climb up, and in his rage to shake them off, the thing breaks, and then he all falls back into hell, and the Buddha weeps for him. This actually happens in Skyward Sword in the Ancient Cistern level. If you guys have remembered, there is a long spider's thread that gets you into this really dark area, and you're going to be surrounded by bokoblins, and they try climbing after you, and you actually are like shaking them off as you go up. Of course, as far as we know, Link is not a sinner from hell, nor does he get punished for trying to knock the people off. But this is a story that you actually reperform from that specific cultural myth.
That's great. And I mean, we could talk about hundreds, if not thousands, of different examples across religious traditions in here. And I guess I want to maybe step back now for a second and think about this broader question of appropriation. So here, the Legend of Zelda game designers are appropriating and incorporating from a particular religious tradition, from the story, and I guess I'll offer it up to you. What are the kind of the pitfalls or the valuable things that can happen with that type of appropriation for game designers at large? Because I'm sure we might have some game designers in here as well.
Well, I'll step back a step further and talk a bit about this idea of a legend, right? Because and versus a myth, right? John's giving us a nice portrait of the myths that are being kind of swept up into this Legend of Zelda in its broad canon, right? But what's the difference maybe between a legend or a myth, or what makes a myth into a legend? Right? How do we form a legend as a way of storytelling? Why do we call it a legend at all? The Legend of Zelda was designed in direct opposition to Mario. Right? Mario is kind of this objective-driven, side-scrolling adventure game, whereas The Legend of Zelda was designed to be primarily narrative, right? Primarily driven by storytelling. And a legend is a form of this storytelling that is steeped in kind of uncertainty. Like, legends are always cloudy, right? When you think about a legend is always steeped in kind of mystery, shrouded in ages of lore. And legends are steeped in uncertainty and ambiguity, and a lot like gameplay, right? Gameplay is always steeped in uncertainty and precarity and ambiguity. So I think the way of playing out a legend through something like a game is a beautiful way to kind of retell myths as legend, right? But maybe I'll leave it here. But that doesn't mean that the appropriation of myths gets excused by the kind of the mystery that legends can cloak them in, right?
I'm glad I was going to call you out on dodging my question.
Nope.
So,
nope, I didn't.
At least brought it back a little bit. Bo, do you want to
responsibility.
Chris Hager.
So this question of appropriation, can it be done well? What are ways to avoid bad appropriation?
Yeah, and, the white guy talking about cultural appropriation.
You said it. So.
I mean, appropriation itself obviously has negative connotations, but I think when we're talking about myths and legends and kind of recreating them in popular media, it's about power and kind of good faith. I mean, are people profiting unfairly from using kind of certain kinds of myths that belong to certain cultures in an unfair way? And that's maybe a discussion to be had within the game industry or just in culture at large, to think about how maybe if we're appropriating myths, how we pay back the communities that they come from in certain ways. But I think on the other hand, it's honoring. It can honor those myths and legends to use them in a way that is respectful and in good faith, and
Yeah, I think appropriation is myth making or legend making, for better and for worse. Right?
And I mean, there's something to be said too about, I mean, Miyamoto not necessarily appropriating, but using his cultural context and his practices and his own history and incorporating something like Shintoism. There's a fantastic, gorgeous masterclass video on YouTube, if you all haven't seen it, by Javed Starrett of Goodblood, that explores kind of right in the middle section of it, all the Shinto influences on the game. And it's beautifully done and shows the ways that Shintoism had a powerful effect on the game designers and how that effect kind of gets into the game itself. And there's kind of a mythological aspect to that Miyamoto wanted to honor. Great. Do you have anything else you wanted to kind of chat about before we move on to the next section?
I think that one of the other things about gameplay in particular is allows you to put yourself in the roles of myths and stories that you particularly like and role play through them, right? Like elements from The Legend of Zelda, not the spider's thread, which might be a little bit more a little harder to catch, but things like the myth of King Arthur, of pulling the sword from the stone. Like, I didn't have a lot of games as a kid where I could pull the sword from the stone, but I always loved doing that, Disneyland or things like that. And then we get Legend of Zelda, and that was something I appreciated because not only was it resonating with this story and the story that was in there, but also this larger legend of King Arthur. And also it makes you look at legends differently, like Peter Pan, which Miyamoto has said was a inspiration for the fairies and the green clothes and the Kokiri in Ocarina of Time specifically. It makes you kind of rethink, what is it like to have a bunch of lost boys or lost children? How is this different in this world? So just reading it through a different lens kind of makes you remix these old stories, and that's something that I'm particularly interested in my work as well.
That's great. Okay, so let's move on to our final section, and then we're going to open it up and allow you all to ask any questions or explore any themes you'd like to bring up. So our last kind of main theme or topic is looking at the Legend of Zelda as religion. So this is stepping back. We're stepping out of the game world and looking at Zelda in a meta context. So thinking about all of us here and how the game may have acted in religious ways. So thinking of how it shaped our thought, actions, and feelings, how it's oriented us in this world. So looking at The Legend of Zelda as a type of religious influence. And so we're breaking that down into 3 subtopics. So we're looking at canonization, what effect did having a Hyrule Historia have on shaping our experience of this gameplay. Another possible topic of conversation is looking at the ethics of the game. What are the things that it allows us to do or encourages us to do, and what does that say about what is right and what is wrong? And then last but not least, looking at personal experience. How does this game shape who we are as players and as humans and as people in the world? So these are the 3 kind of possible conversations. And again, we're going to open up to a real quick vote and then jump right in. And it should be live. Oh, at the end, ethics jumped over. I thought for sure we were talking about ethics. Okay, so it looks like we're going with ethics.
Maybe we can have a little care.
That's right.
As a treat.
We'll talk about it. Okay, so jumping to ethics. So, what worldview does the Legend of Zelda series promote? What types of things does it say are good, bad, or things that we should do? So I guess I'll open it up kind of broadly, and then we can jump in on some of the specifics. To anybody?
Sure. I guess I have a little anecdote for this. I was playing this with my partner, and playing Ocarina of Time with my partner. And we were getting to the place where we had to go into Dodongo's cavern and kill Dodongo so that we can save the Gorons and everything. And for people who are familiar with it, it seems like a pretty straightforward answer. There is a monster in the cave. The people say we can't get into the cave, so go slay the monster. Sounds all good, but then she's like, why are you slaying the poor lizard? And I'm like, well, because I was told to do it. Who told you to do it? The Gorons. Like, well, why? Because the best rocks are in there. Oh. So you went in there into something else's cave. It's like, it wasn't its cave originally, it's called the Dodongo's Cavern. And so I had this moment where I'm like, but Ganondorf made it big. Who told you that? The ones who want the rocks. So you get these moments of playing against the game and thinking of this and thinking like, the design of the Ocarina of Time especially, and games up to from Ocarina of Time to Breath of the Wild a lot, are pretty linear. It tells you like, oh, you do this, you finish this, and you don't think about the consequences, right? Like you kill the monster, move on to the next one, right? If you want, you can kill these birds and then have them attack you. That's cuckoos, right? But a lot of the like, oh, just follow the path and things will be okay is one of these worldviews that is kind of ethically questionable in the Legend of Zelda series just from a design perspective. I'm sorry, I saw him follow the Dodongo, like, mind blast. Save the Dodongos, hashtag.
So let's kind of focus on some of the stuff we have here. So I guess one of the positive aspects, or one of the things that people have talked positively about, is the way Zelda, the entire story kind of interacts with the natural world. Do you all kind of see examples of that, or ways that it kind of positively shapes what we might think of in terms of nature?
Yeah, just to jump on the back of what John was saying, right? Being positioned as a hero in a game is not something that's unique, right? But when we're speaking about religion, right, being positioned as a hero in a game that has this kind of inherent religious worldview to it, I think is a little bit different, right? That we're inheriting an ethical system, a value-based system that we are expected to be performing through. But that's why then the games become so fascinating to me, right? Because there are so many things, like you're saying, that are telling you what to do, right? There's kind of the worldview that the game inhabits, right? So this value system, this religion of the game. There are the particular kind of motivations that you have as an individual character within the game. There are characters in the game telling you what to do, right? Kill this creature so we can get to our pretty rocks, right? But then there's what makes games unique is that there's the game system that also is telling you what to do and limiting what you can do, right? So the ethical decisions that you have to make as a player are limited, or you have to push back against so many systems in order to make your own ethical decisions, right? So, but it's interesting, right, that the Legend of Zelda as a system that is also forwarding, as canon is forwarding this way that we have to think about the natural world is something that we automatically jump to when we think about the Legend of Zelda. But is it something that it's yelling or shoving down our throats or preaching at us? No, not really, right? But what it's doing is making us play through a value system that's teaching us that this is important, right? And so that's why thinking about games in particular and religion is just utterly fascinating.
Right, so at the same time that there's kind of a good versus evil motif in the end in most Zelda games, I think what it does an amazing job ethically is making the player kind of bring the world that they're inhabiting back into right relation with itself. So that kind of goes along with, questioning the motives of the different kinds of clans or communities that you're working on behalf of at whatever moment. And the game kind of steering you to the point where you're not only trying to bring harmony back to the world that you're in, so it's not just the hero doing good and achieving glory. It's if the glory comes through anything, it's through restoring a kind of harmony. And I think like a game like Breath of the Wild does a nice job kind of physically manifesting that with like the purple goo that kind of saturates the world that you're trying to maybe not save, but restore or bring health back to in a certain way that kind of grounds you in that environment or that natural world.
So the next question I'm going to ask is going to be kind of a step back from the game world itself and getting again to a question of game design and a larger question. And I'd be remiss not to call out that we have 4 dudes up here talking about a game where you can only play as basically a male character and maybe kind of generally ambiguous at best. So what's the problematic with the fact that, there doesn't seem to be much gender inclusion in terms of the type of player and character you can inhabit? And are there ways around it? Are there things they could do differently? What are your guys' thoughts on that?
I think it's hugely problematic, right? But I think there's also this wonder of gaming that gaming and playing games can be very, very queer, right? That you can play and resist through your play in a way that is very, very that is queering a game world, right? That Legend of Zelda, I think, is one of the earliest games where you can decide what your name is, right? And then that name is spoken to you throughout the game, right? That that the character is named Link, right, I don't think is a mistake, right? I know it's not a mistake, right? That Link is a way of, and we can play through Link in a way that can be queer, I think. That we can push against what is prescribed, but at the same time, how far does that pushing really get us? You know, and what does it really get us? And who are we visible to when we're doing that, right? Yeah.
Oh, do you want to add anything to that, or any extra thoughts?
No, I co-sign John.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, for John.
The interesting thing too about The Legend of Zelda and focusing on Zelda as the legend, even though we don't usually play as Zelda except for the Wand of Gamelon, right? Yes, some people know what I'm talking about.
No.
The idea of Zelda and the reason she's called Zelda is because Shigeru Miyamoto really liked the name Zelda based on Zelda Fitzgerald, F. Scott Fitzgerald's wife, who was this beautiful woman, and he kind of used the name Zelda and the character Zelda to promote this beauty and this thing that ought to be protected, and also that shows this wisdom of this area, right? And of thinking before acting and that sort of thing. But there's nothing really saying that we couldn't have a Zelda incarnation who was a male, maybe like a male poet who is sitting and is thinking about beauty most of the time, while we have the courage of a female protagonist being the one who runs the area. We can still have that triad, I guess, of different ideas, just put with different genders as well. And I think that would be something really interesting to look at, because that does push against a lot of the ways that we have coded gender, especially in America and the US.
Yeah, and I guess I do have something, and people can push back against this if they want, but I think that the way that Link is depicted is androgynous enough that it would lend itself to a gender change in a future game, kind of along the lines of a Doctor Who. There shouldn't be, people might disagree, something that's inherently masculine about a Doctor Who, and I think the way that the narrative progresses and the way that Link is drawn artistically, it wouldn't take that much to, switch the valence to imply that Link identifies as a woman instead of a man. They could have easily put more masculine features into that character.
So we'll kind of step back again to a larger meta question, not just looking at the game, but looking at the community. I mean, I don't know, but you all look pretty awesome, and I'm assuming you're all pretty awesome. In my experience, the Legend of Zelda community is probably might be one of the least toxic of the gaming communities, which is pretty exciting. So maybe that says something about the game design and the way it impacts us and shapes how we form community and the types of things that we're interested in and the people we're willing to engage with. You all have anything to add or say, or?
I agree wholeheartedly.
I'm not sure I know enough about the community myself.
Oh.
I'm positive about it, but...
Y'all need to become friends with John, because he doesn't think you're nice.
No! That's not what I said! Save the dog!
Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground, and I'd like to open it up to y'all to ask us some questions, even if it's to say, hey, please go back and talk about something else because we didn't like what you said. So we're happy to do that as well. So let's perhaps open it up to some Q&A, and I think how we typically do this, there's a mic down here, and if folks kind of want to come up and line up, we'll take kind of one at a time. And if you could say your name, that'd be great.
Sure. I'm Alec.
Hi, Alec.
I love the study of religion and Zelda, so this panel is for me, so thank you. My question is, what do you think of the theory that Majora Mask is about a town that turned their backs on the goddesses?
Yes, the resident Majora Mask expert. I think that's a really complicated question because I think the goddesses in Zelda are very complicated. I think that there's something to think about in terms of masks for sure that's important. A philosopher that I really likes to talk about how masks not only are worn by things that are profound, but masks are also necessary to hide the shame of gods. And I think that there's something kind of weird in the Zelda legend that these pure goddesses create this, imbue their power into this object, the Triforce, that is supposed, but the Triforce has no will of its own. It can so easily be appropriated for evil as it can for good. And how Majora's Mask then kind of goes back and experiments with the role of masks and what masks do to people, I think is really interesting. And I'm dancing around your question a little bit because I don't know that I have a good answer to your question specifically, but I think that there's a lot to think about, and I wish we had time to talk about it here, just about this idea that the town of Majora's Mask is, they think of Hyrule as heaven, that they're kind of stuck, that maybe they're stuck in this like shame, in this kind of masked world, ruled over by a mask, and that has to do with them turning their backs on the goddesses, but maybe it's the other way around.
To add on that, I think that to look in the game there, it's in the it's in the land of Termina, right? So your question sounds like a very Hyrulean way of asking that. Right. It's like, those people over on that side, they didn't listen to the goddesses, so the moon came down, right? Which I think is great, and like I would love to see the carpenter from Majora's Mask talking to like King Zora and trying to understand like what's going on. I would just want to see them on any topic, but like just to see like what their ideas of in this theological question is, because we don't get a lot of that. Termina was an interesting thing because we have a 3D world fully realized that is adjacent to but not part of the same mythos of God. So, yeah.
Thank you.
That was a great question, Alec. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Eric, and I wanted to go back first off to the comment about queering the text and queering Legend of Zelda and the naming of the protagonist as Link, and I thought that was really interesting when you sort of go back to, I don't pretend to be a religious scholar, but like I work in classical literature, but this idea of like religare, the Latin etymology of that
To
sort
bind,
of, to
yeah.
bind something. I think that's
Exactly.
a fascinating connection.
Yeah.
So on that note, I wanted to return to a theme that sort of was, I think, alluded to during this panel was ritual. And how does ritual sort of work in, not only in like the diegetic world of the Legend of Zelda, but also how religion is sort of how what we do as, I guess, like in your theme of Zelda as religion, how are we as players like participating in ritual when we play this game?
Exactly.
So,
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I look at playing games and doing ritual as almost identical, right? Ritual is when you take something and you take a space or a place and you set it apart, and then you make certain rules that can take place inside there or not. There are certain things that are valued in there that are not valued in other places, right? It's an orientation towards certain objects, and then you give those objects unbelievable amounts of value that they don't have otherwise, right? So glasses of wine, pieces of bread that are ordinary everyday objects, when you ritualize them and put them within a ritual space, perform around them ritually, become imbued with unbelievable power. Right? I think playing a game is almost exactly the same thing, right? Think about, we can talk about it in video games, it's maybe simpler to talk about it something like football, right? A game space is something that's set apart where things, 10 yards don't matter anywhere else. Who cares about 10 yards? In football, they're life and death, right? This little thing that's made out of pigskin or whatever doesn't matter unless you're the only one who's able to have it at a certain amount of time. Right? Video games do the same exact thing. They're setting, and we can see that through the digital architecture. They're setting a certain place apart, right? You can only access this digital world through a certain space, time, right? And so when we play that game, when we play The Legend of Zelda, we're giving into its worldview. We're giving into its value system. And we're saying, yes, I agree, right? This world has value, right? And so then when we're able to play that game, we're given power inside of that value system. So when we talk about something about queering a game or resisting its value system, we're doing that with ritual power, right? We're saying, yes, I agree with this world. I'll take its rules on, and then I'm going to resist them, right? So I think when you overlay these worldviews, these ritual worlds and these game worlds, you see the power that gaming can have, right? And then when you see a room like this with people who fill up like this, who all really love this world, right? And all believe in this value system, right? Or all want to assent to its rules. Imagine what we can do if we stop pushing against it, right? Or saying what we value against it or not, right? It's a fascinating question. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Great question, Eric. Thank you.
Hey there, I'm Hayla Byrne. I'm glad that y'all are here and everybody else who's in the room. I was wondering a little bit more about your thoughts about kind of nature versus technology. I feel like this has come up repeatedly as a theme, and I'd love to hear you pick it apart.
So, we're all like, which one?
You made a noise, John. It's not you.
Okay, it's on me now.
You nodded.
Okay, here we go. So one of the things I've noticed in Legend of Zelda games, originally Miyamoto wanted to make them a sci-fi sort of series. Link was the idea of hyperlink. He liked the idea of, and also link to the character and to the world, but hyperlinks as well. And also the Triforce he wanted to have is like computer chips. He was kind of trying to bring these things like, oh, we can put these together. And that didn't really fit into the first couple ones, but then as we move further on, we have a lot of these characters who are, or creatures who are these large machines, like in Breath of the Wild. You have these large kind of divine beasts, which are divine in the way they make machines. Same with Twilight Princess, who have all these great gears and things, and they're just going around. So I think like, my understanding of some versions of technology in religious ideas is something that's usually attached with something man-made or hubristic, but it's really interesting in things like Breath of the Wild, where you get these things as these natural but also awesome creatures that are not quite machines and not quite human. So I think like that really, for me, goes into the idea of the uncanny, this place between what is real and what is not, and something that, you know, when we're playing a game, we are seeing these things that aren't actually real and aren't actually alive, acting as if they are.
Yeah.
So the creation between technology and nature is the same between you as a natural person, probably, and the game, right? There are also different machines that play Zelda, and it just becomes very strange indeed, right? So I think like the actual playing of it does reflect a lot of the sort of technology and nature that we see in the games.
And just briefly, I think it's interesting that a lot of the technology in Zelda, especially in the later games, is animated by magic, which is kind of this mediating force, this uncanny force that humans also have access to. So I think it collapses the binary a little bit in the sense that both, you know, organic life as we might perceive it and the machines are kind of both tapped into the same kind of force, whereas the world we live in, that doesn't seem as clear.
It certainly isn't like Tolkien, Isengard's like machines versus like the ents. It's kind of like these different balances that have their own like natural realms. So yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, I feel like now I would like, if anybody makes videos on YouTube, to have a Horizon Zero Dawn versus contender.
Yeah, and then add in Shadow of the Colossus in there too.
Oh, yeah.
Great question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Zach. I was recently writing a script for a video. I swear I'm not trying to plug myself here, but it was about like music theory applied to the Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time's Fire Temple. And in the original version of that, there was a Muslim chant being used, and they cut that from the game. As well as there was the Star and Crescent featured on a few things in the game, and that got cut as well.
Yeah, it's actually on our slides too.
I was kind of, I guess I'm more curious about other examples of real-world religions, either symbols or other features being in other Zelda games, just because now I'm super curious of like what I may have missed that there is.
Yeah, do you want to bring up the sacred imagery one? I think it has some there. Some are not necessarily, oh, this went far back, we wanted to. So, do not pay attention to the men behind the curtain. Here we are. No, we missed one. Go back, there you go. So, a couple of ones that I was able to find. In the original Legend of Zelda, that thing I've shown pictures like, what is this? I was like, oh, it's a Bible. It's like, no, it's a magic book. That is the magic book and the magic shield. Now, I haven't been able to find any like real scholarly work on, yes, this is why it is this, but I do think that when you don't have a lot of pixels to work with, trying to show some sort of symbol that's like, this is something different, right? Or something different than the shield you have, or this has some sort of power to it, using a cross is, for some people, particular religious ideas might be a little bit crass, but in other ways it's like, this is an interesting shorthand. Same with the Gerudo, this is the old version of the Gerudo symbol. If you click on that link, we'll actually have the video of the music, but we don't need to go to that. So yeah, for people who aren't familiar, that's changed. But I've also just noticed a lot of motifs anytime you see the Temple of Time and things, it's a lot of Christian art and architecture versus a lot of different shrines and things are usually Eastern in origin. So it's, besides that, and the Mitsuroko, which is quasi-religious, there are a lot of borrowings that go on.
I mean, actually, one of our side projects that we were trying to do is actually get a catalog going online so that people could have access to some of these materials. So hopefully we'll have more for you later.
That's awesome. Great. Thank you so much.
Oh dear. I'm not tall enough. I'm Ainsley, and
Ainsley.
I had a bigger question about the temples, because you brought them up all the time. First of all, the temples are scattered throughout the land, and like they're near the Zora Island and near the Gorons, which don't really have a religion. Why do you think those temples were created if there wasn't like, okay, I'm sorry, if there wasn't like something for them to worship, as usual like temples are for? Even the temple in Ocarina of Time doesn't really have anything that's worshiping other than like the Triforce and the goddess.
And the spiritual stones, which get put in there too.
And then still.
Well, I think just, I mean, you can jump on the tail end of this. What temples do is, like I was speaking about ritual space, what temples do is organize space, right? And they make great game levels, right? Because there's something in the middle that you have to get to, and the temple is gonna slowly kind of whittle its way and organize you towards that thing, right? So whatever's always in the middle is always the most important thing, right? So a temple is gonna, like a cave or in these systems, these temples are gonna organize space in a way that's gonna prioritize or create a hierarchy for you, right?
I mean,
So in some ways, sorry to interrupt, so in some ways you're saying there's kind of a distinction in that maybe it's just functional game design as opposed to being kind of in the middle?
Or it's where functional game design meets cultural expectations or tropes, right? So we always think of the architecture and the gameplay are playing with each other, right? And we're reorganizing each other all the time. So we're creating hierarchies, we're creating points of importance through like the collapsing of sacred space and game space, right, together.
I was just going to quickly add, I completely agree. They express power. And so even if there's no one going into a church or a temple to worship, maybe this giant structure in the middle of Hyrule somewhere reminds everyone constantly that they're Hyrulean, and that there's a certain value system that is reinscribed even by it being there. And there's lots of historical examples of time periods where not a lot of peasants went to big Catholic churches, but that's, they had to see it every day. So they never forgot, who had and possessed and could express power in that particular milieu.
I also think it's interesting that, like asking why were these things made, there is a whole society around the United States and other places that are just the Labyrinth Society, that people have made like outdoor labyrinths that aren't particularly complicated, but people go and walk through them kind of ritually and meditatively as just a way of getting into space. I'm not as familiar with it, so if anyone else is, I'm sorry if this is it isn't a good explanation of it, but just the idea of going through a ritual space might be another way for this. Also, in each Zelda game, sometimes temples are different. Like, we've got the Stone Tower Temple, which seems to definitely be like this in Majora's Mask, which is like, this is a big monument to something. But then you have, in the original ones, they weren't called temples, they were called labyrinths, because they were just underground spaces. I think like a work or a YouTube video for someone who's out there who looks at each of the temples in one of these games and
Where's
tries to
that?
make an idea, right? Makes an idea of like, why would this be made in the same sort of way? And looking at these ritual and monumental ideas might be a good thing to look at.
I think there's actually also an interesting tie here to the technology and nature question. That at least in Ocarina of Time, the temples or the levels of the other races end up being kind of the natural world. So you have the Gorons where you have to go to Jabba Jabba's belly. You have the Gorons where you're entering into Dongo's cavern, and you have the Korok where you're entering into the Great Deku Tree. Whereas the Hylians are the ones that seem to build kind of these temples. So even in the in-game, there's this distinction between the technological Hylians, perhaps, and the more natural other races, which has actually significant other kind of issues in the study of religion and looking at other religions as more primitive and perhaps. So that's a fantastic question.
Well, you got us going now. Thanks.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Mice. I wanted to ask a little bit, I'm not as familiar with the earlier games, but having watched a significant portion of the Twilight Princess and like Breath of the Wild, we're beginning to see much more stronger female characters. And the implication, particularly in Breath of the Wild, is that, yeah, you've been asleep recovering, but Zelda's been doing battle for 100 years. Like, she's the real badass of the whole thing, even though you're playing as Link. So do you think that kind of that evolution will hopefully see like some flick in that at some point and be able to kind of explore that, like the stronger female side of things?
Before we answer, I just want to say this is probably going to be our last question for tonight because we're running out of time. Otherwise, it's been great. So thank you.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Historically speaking, it's usually been the males that have been like the heroes and everything else, particularly religions on in your life. But
no, in a lot of the earlier Zelda media too, and things like are not canonical, like Wand of Gamelon and things like that, which you can play Zelda Wand of Gamelon. I don't know, I haven't played it, I don't know why I'm on
He was
this
arguing
like,
all earlier, why? I mean, he wants that one bad.
I'm just like, why is this in Triforce Heroes when you're dressing up in different costumes? One of the interesting things is there are a lot of depictions of an older king, like the King of Red Lions in the Wind Waker, or the King of Hyrule in Zelda 2, who doesn't trust his young, impulsive son to know where the Triforce of Courage is, but tells Zelda, and then Zelda gets put asleep for it. That's Zelda the First, by the way. That's why after every Zelda from that, the prince says, "Oh, I'm so sad about my sister. Every woman needs to be named Zelda," which is kind of strange. But I think like these sort of it's just kind of a tragedy every time that the sort of labor that is shown through Zelda is labor that's often ignored too, in gender terms, right? Because she is running the kingdom, making sure Link is not going to be stabbed while he is asleep in Breath of the Wild, right? Throughout Ocarina of Time, she makes sure everything is together, and then like has the Ocarina of Time make sure everything works. But we don't get that labor because at least a lot of game designers in the past have not found a lot of good ways of how do we make that fun? Like how do we make running a kingdom fun? But
like
now we're here.
kind of like running the show.
Exactly. So yeah, I'm gonna have to call it here. If y'all could give a round of applause for our panelists. I think I said it on the hopefully maybe more to go through questions. If you have questions for them, we'll be more able to talk, and you can reach out to us in other ways. Paxers, you've been amazing. Thank you for coming out today, and I hope you have a great rest of your PAX.